One year when I was about 15, I went to a scout camp in Bear Lake in Idaho. I haven't forgotten about it since, and I still honestly believe I saw something supernatural. The whole week we were there, it had been mostly sunny and warm, but one day it got really cloudy and stormy. It started out as a drizzle during the day, but quickly turned into a torrential downpour at night. The campsite troop was assigned to us that night on the bank of the lake towards the south end. Anyway, I woke up in the middle of the night. It was pitch black and the wind was howling like a chorus of upset toddlers. The reason I had to wake up? I needed to pee like crazy. So we have this buddy rule that if you go anywhere you need to bring your buddy with you, especially at night. It's not called Bear Lake for nothing. So I wake him up and tell him I need to go. He groggily says, "Are you serious?" When he saw me wiggling like a madman, he got out of his sleeping bag, grabbed his flashlight and jacket, and we get our boots on and unzip the tent. Instantly, we become drenched. We start walking towards the outhouse when about midway there we hear this loud-ass roar. Thinking it was a bear, I start to panic. We turned around but couldn't see anything without our flashlights. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminates the sky, and we see a creature with a massive wingspan. A long neck, spiked tail, and as it flew over us, we could see the silhouette of it, its wings in a downbeat. As it passes, the air from the downbeat literally pushes us into the mud. Terrified, we run back to the tent and hide. Needless to say, I totally forgot about needing to pee until morning. To this day, me and my friend still talk about what we saw, and we both agree that it was a dragon. I love to share this story, because when I open with, "I encountered a werewolf once," people are immediately intrigued by the absurdity of what I'm saying. These two stories happened almost a decade apart, and for obvious reasons I cannot guarantee they are related at all, but it seems reasonable to at least entertain the idea. The first story takes place at my cousin's trailer, a couple of houses down from mine. We live in a rural town at the foot of the Appalachian region, so there's plenty of forest coverage around us. We were playing hide and seek and all was well, until I tagged my cousin and made him the seeker. He hated seeking, so instead of playing the game he decided to sit and quit on his front porch. The time was around midnight, maybe a bit earlier, so naturally it was pitch black, and perfect for scaring someone. My cousin's friend, my brother and I began to devise a plan to get revenge on my cousin for being a sore loser, and we came up with this. We were to lure him to the edge of the forest, and my brother was to jump out at him. A very simple plan for a couple of 13-year-olds. So we got to it. We managed to convince him that there was something making a noise in the woods, and so he came with us to investigate. As we walked to the edge of the forest, we heard something inside walking with us. I looked at my cousin's friend, and we were both grinning, knowing it was my brother beyond those trees. Then out of nowhere, my brother bursts from the side of my cousin's trailer, screaming and roaring, sending all of us into a fearful panic. He got us good. So good, in fact, that we totally forgot about the noise coming from the forest that could no longer be attributed to my brother. As we were all laughing about the scare, we heard a horrifying noise coming from the depths behind us. It was a loud scream that sounded like a man screaming for help, and slowly changed pitch, and to this day I swear it said help. After about 5 seconds of human screaming sounds, it turned into the most guttural roar I've ever heard personally. It was chilling. We ran inside and my cousin opened the blinds to his windows, and it was right then we noticed the obvious and haunting sight of a full moon. Yes, we don't know what could have made that noise. Yes, there are farms around. It could have been a cow being attacked by coyotes or pretty much anything that happens in rural America, but I've never heard anything like it before or since. Jump forward 9 years. I'm coming home late from work. As I'm driving, I see two bright orange eyes peering at me from the side of the dark road. I thought it may have been a fox or a dog, but as I got closer I realized it was not your average fox or dog. It was a massive, black, wolf-like dog. The animal was so tall while on all fours that it seemed to be almost as big as my car. Its back legs were almost kangaroo-like, very long and muscular looking while the front legs were short and thin. It dashed across the road and in front of my car, jumping the fence to the left with no struggle. When I got home, I nonchalantly told my family that I finally got to see the werewolf that made the noise so many years ago. I don't necessarily believe that it's an actual werewolf, but I cannot honestly say it isn't. Anyway, I thought you guys might enjoy this story. Keep a keen eye out on full moon nights. I was out camping with my friend Josiah in the mountains of Pennsylvania. It was the weird in-between season after winter, but before spring really kicks off. There were still no leaves on the trees, but the day of hiking to the camping spot was about 60 degrees. I bought a small rifle as we wanted to do some plinking while we were out. We set up the camp at about 3 p.m, leaving plenty of time for shooting. Just two buddies with guns out in the middle of the mountains. It was an incredible day. Night began to fall upon us. The air started to chill, and we built a fire for the night. Breaking out the bourbon, we talked about everything from future plans, girlfriends, and how society sucks. Josiah was used to camping, an industrious guy who had a passion for the outdoors, but to put it kindly, was not the smartest person I've ever met. From across the mountain, we could begin to hear coyotes. This is common when camping in Pennsylvania. Something you should know about coyotes is that they are incredibly noisy, and you can hear them from miles away. They are completely terrified of people, and therefore not a danger in the slightest. Or so I thought. The coyote calls were getting closer. Fine, we thought, as they were probably just using the trails to move more efficiently between the mountain peaks. This comforting logic dissolved over the next hour or two as the chilling howls kept getting closer. Josiah casually mentioned that the coyotes are close, but he and I both knew they were actively avoiding us. Shortly after he said this, the call stopped, and we were in complete silence. The pops and flickers of the dying campfire were our only indication that time itself hadn't frozen. That's when the bushes behind us began to rustle. Grabbing my flashlight, I scanned the woods around Josiah and me, only to catch the reflection of about half a dozen set of eyes in a circle around us. We both realize what is happening at the same time. Josiah grabs the rifle, hands it to me, and in return I hand him the flashlight. I slowly chamber around into the semi-automatic 22 caliber rifle, realizing that I probably don't have enough firepower to stop all of these coyotes should the situation escalate. Josiah and I stand with our backs towards the fire, him using the light to illuminate each coyote, the moment they break a twig underneath their movement. The coyotes, once illuminated, let out a bark, then move behind a tree. It appears as if hunting us is a game to them, as we stand there playing this game of high-stakes flashlight tag with a rifle. I come to presume that these dogs are just coming out of a very harsh winter and are probably starved. The standoff lasts for hours. Just as quickly as they surrounded us, they vanished into the darkness of the forest, only to resume their hunting calls on other mountains. I slept with a rifle that night. To this day, I still don't know why a typically harmless animal made us fight for our lives that night. The next morning, the situation didn't get any better. Central Pennsylvania has odd weather snaps. The day before, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This morning, There were about 3 inches of snow on the ground, temperatures were below 10 degrees, and heavy snowstorms rolling in. This was uncalled for by every weather agency I checked before we set out on this adventure. We packed for temperatures as low as 30, but not this tundra. Hands were bright red, dexterity lost, and I've been cold before, but this was the first time I was cold and unprepared enough to worry. Forget cooking breakfast. We needed to get out of there before the snow picked up. We tore down the tents, put on as many layers as possible, stretching shirts over shirts, packing bags, and cleaning the site in less than an hour. We make our way down the war trophy mountain that we battled for the night prior, but the trails below are covered by unpacked snow. We were going to have to use map and compass. We were also going to have to trailblaze through more difficult terrain if we wanted to make it to the car. We find a felled tree, lay out the map in the quickly accumulating snow and try to orient ourselves. If you've never been cold, hungry, and most likely dehydrated while trying to identify mountain peaks and where they correspond on a map, then let me be the first to tell you that it is an aggravating experience where any decision could mean the difference between living and dying. We find 3 identifiable peaks, see the creek that we crossed in the previous morning, and have a plan to get through the 5 miles as quickly as possible in a straight shot. This wasn't a typical hiking pace. We were just short of jogging, both to keep body temperature up and to expedite the trek until we could get into my used sedan view and pray that the heat worked. 4 inches of snow were now weighing down our footsteps. As we approached the creek, we remembered that the bridge we crossed before was another 3 miles out of our way, a distance we were unwilling to add to our already freezing bodies. That was only just beginning to freeze, but quickly. Josiah heads northwest along the riverbank to look for a method of crossing. I direct myself southwest to do the same. The instructions were to not walk for more than 200 meters away from the central location, so that we could still hear each other calling that a solution was found. Within minutes, Josiah calls. A tree had fallen over the creek that offered about 3 feet of clearance above the hypothermic waters, and I offered to cross first. Straddling this tree, I slide myself over the waters rushing below me, mistakenly seeing my pocket knife fall out of my pocket into those same waters. A mild inconvenience in any other situation would be the loss of a necessary tool for getting out of this occasion. I crossed the river, choosing that creek bed to be the resting place for the knife. Josiah crosses after, clumsier than myself. His foot dips slightly into the creek, dampening his sock. Our time to now get into the car is now cut into minutes, if we do not get his foot warmed. We sit down, take his boots off, take off his socks, and the cold winter and snow must have felt like knives against his skin. With our reduced movement of our cold fingers, I'm helping him find a fresh pair of socks in my pack, as he was wearing his last 2 pairs. Socks are something I always bring in quantity on these trips. I find the socks. Josiah puts them on, struggles to put on his boot, and we eventually begin our voyage again. We traverse the last few miles of the wilderness and make our way back to the SUV. At this point, we are nearly running towards the vehicle. There are 5 inches of snow. I unlock the door, dump our packs in the back, and turn the key. The car revs, and the sound of the engine roaring over the snow was like the cries of victory we deserved. We kept the car in park, pushed on the gas to rev the engine up to about 2,000, heating up the cabin for the 2 of us. We could finally feel our fingers and our toes. Driving back over the mountain, listening to the radio weather forecasts, mocking us by their explanations of how serious this unforeseen storm is, and that school districts all over the county are already closing for the following Monday. We get back to my farmhouse, heat up coffee, make eggs, and laugh about how we nearly perished twice in the last 48 hours. After breakfast, after nearly dying, Josiah drives home. Camping is about challenging yourself and reconnecting to what mankind once was, with some added amenities. That trip was far more than the challenge either of us had in mind, but it added confidence to our ability to work together in bad situations. I live in Wyoming, Michigan, about a walking distance away from a resurrection cemetery. If you look it up on Google Maps, you'll see it has a tree line surrounding it. The tree line closest to the woods is where I've seen something multiple times. Well, you can determine what it is for yourself. The first encounter I had with it was with my sister. She was going to walk through the cemetery. It was late at night, and I had the gut instinct to go with her, so I did. We were playing Pokemon Go, and I didn't like the forested area around it, especially this large pine tree. That, via a maintenance path, led to the crematorium. I was scared out of my mind, but we went towards the crematorium anyway to get a Pokestop and find a Jigglypuff. We had to go so close that we were now on the maintenance path, but the nice cobblestone half. It was when I looked to my right that I saw the creature, hunched over. It almost looked like a normal human being, but more terrifying. It appeared to have seen me too because it stood up. It was tall, at least 7 feet in height. I told my sister to run and we legged it home, where I proceeded to pray in my room for a while. My mum had a sighting too. She mentioned seeing it, something grey, hunched over the top of the pine tree. She mentioned seeing something grey and hunched over, in the top of the pine tree. When she looked back though, it was gone. Safe to say we went home early that day. I consider myself a little bit sensitive, and when I close my eyes sometimes around that area, I think I can see it. The 2 gaping holes staring back at me. My mum described the creature, and I recognized it as something I'd drawn a few weeks ago. I burned this image, but have since redrawn it. My most recent sighting, and the one that kept me from returning to the cemetery, happened in broad daylight with a friend. His name is Mark. We wandered around the cemetery for hours until my arms started hurting, and I decided that we should go home for a snack. As we walked, my anxiety heightened. I told him about this creature, but I suspected we wouldn't have to worry as it was daytime. As we were walking along the sidewalk, about to reach the tree line, I saw a dead squirrel and dog in the middle of the sidewalk. I looked up and I see the crawler running straight past into the tree line. It was grey and ran on all 4s rather than 2 legs. I told my friend to run and he did. We both ran until we reached the intersection. I would appreciate any advice on what the hell this is. I was about 14 years old when my dad went away on business for a few weeks, leaving me to tend to the farm by myself. Mostly just feeding horses and chickens, not a big deal. The farm was way outside of town, and down a dirt road. The nearest neighbors were 2 pastures away, and my dad insisting on never locking the doors. The farm was always seriously eerie in the mornings. After the first few nights, I started hearing tapping on the windows late at night, so I obviously broke Dad's rules and started locking the front and back doors. Then the window tapping advanced to doorknob rattling, and then I started finding odd things around the farm while doing the chores. One morning, I found the horses stuffing themselves in all the hay storage stall. The latch for that stall was very stiff and a little complicated, so it had obviously been opened by a person, not the horses. The worst morning, I stepped out onto the back porch to find all the chickens sitting in a row along the side of a shed, evenly spaced, with their necks broken. 1 or 2 of them were still moving a bit. They looked set out on display. The chicken yard latch had obviously been opened by a person and left open. The worst part was when my dad finally came home, he blamed me for every bit of the oddness and disaster, and acted like I was stupid for being scared. He insisted that the horses open the hay latch and that the dogs were responsible for opening the chicken yard and the line of poised, broken-necked chickens. I think it's worth mentioning that our next-door neighbor was well known for being absolutely mental. Documented bits of crazy that my dad was entirely aware of included putting bear traps in his haystacks to catch the kids who'd been playing with it, and blocking off a neighbor's driveway with a load of dirt as revenge for not letting him ride his horses on their property. So my guess is that our neighbor knew that my dad was gone because his vehicle wasn't present, could hear my music turned up in the distance across the pastures, and figured terrorizing a middle school girl would be a fun hobby for a few weeks. I should start by telling you a bit about myself. I'm a guy in my 20s. I'm 6'4", I'm a vet, student, and train kickboxing. There isn't much that scares me, and people can regard me as an intimidating dude. My university is on top of a hill outside of town. From my dorm window on the 7th floor, I can see huge wheat fields and the nearby forest. My first encounter was last year. I have a German shepherd called Hades and a husky pup called Ragnar. That day, I left uni quite late. It was already dark outside. Usually I don't mind taking them out at night, as I can let them run without their leashes. They are trained, and I know they're going to listen to me. Besides, I know everyone knew them and wouldn't hurt them if they were left out. They have collars that light up, since Hades is fully black and Ragnar is fully white, which makes it hard to see him during the winter, if I could see them all the time. We walked for a while, and they were playing and running around, and at some point Hades stops and starts growling, looking into the wheat fields down the hill. I didn't think about it. There are bats, owls, and other critters around us. I leashed them, not wanting to run after them if they decided to go chase something. About half an hour of non-stop growling later, I'd had enough and decided to take Hades home and go out so that Ragnar can run a bit more. I got home and expected him to go into his cage. He likes sleeping there and I never lock it. But that night, all he did was stand at the window looking out. Since the pup was whining and wanting to go out again, I tried to drag Hades into the cage and lock him until I got back. Who knew? Maybe he might be trying to go out the window. I got a look, and on the parking lot, I saw a dark figure circling the cars. Thinking that it might be some local trying to steal something, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it at it. It wasn't a thief. In fact, I wouldn't say it was human at all. It looked up, eyes reflecting the light from the flashlight. It was black. Its head looked very similar to Hades. It was standing on all fours, but when I shone the light, it stood up. The roof of the cars barely reaching its midsection. It let out a growl, which I later learned that many of the tenants heard. Hades then went wild, trying to bust out the cage. Ragnar was whining ever louder. I realized he didn't want to go out. He was trying to get as far away from the window as possible. The growl made me flinch and I dropped the flashlight through the window. I tried to see it again, but it was too dark. I heard the crunching of snow as it left. The next morning I went to find my flashlight and found huge dog-like footprints in the snow and a foul smell that still lingered. I borrowed infrared binoculars from a hunter friend of mine ever since, and I've seen it 4 times in the forest, twice crossing the field, and once it's come near the hill to look up. I and my roommate have been taking turns keeping watch at night when Hades starts growling. I don't take the dogs out at night, and Ragnar doesn't play and run around anymore. He just stays pressed against my feet. I hope he grows out of it. I do mineral exploration in Alaska. I'm often transported by helicopter to remote regions throughout the already remote state. A few years ago, my field partner and I came across what seemed like a bear kill of a caribou carcass. but when we got closer it seemed odd. The only thing that remained were two spines and one head. The head was arranged such that the mouth was wide open, pointing up like it was screaming towards the heavens. The eyes were cut out. Very weird. There's also been many instances of coming across old miner buildings littered with dog skeletons, or having strangely new children's clothes thrown about. I lived in Montana on some land my dad owns, and I was hiking up a mountain like I do frequently. I heard this really weird screaming coming from the other side of the mountain, away from my house and deeper into the woods. It wasn't a mountain lion, too deep and long, and it went on for about 10 seconds, and I'm fairly confident it wasn't a bear. It kind of sounded like a human, almost distorted, almost like someone was possessed by something, sort of like what you'd hear in a horror movie. I got to the top of the mountain, pulled out my binoculars, and looked into the general direction of the scream. That's where I saw it. A weird, humanoid-looking creature, as white as paper and without any hair or clothes or genitals for that matter. And its arms were longer than its body. It had these huge black eyes that covered most of its face, and it was walking, but as soon as I saw it, it stopped and stared at me. I watched it carefully, I don't even know for how long, thinking that it was staring straight into my soul. I had to look away because my eyes had started watering from not blinking. When I looked back, after wiping my eyes, it was gone. I couldn't see it anymore, which made me think it was a weird hallucination or something. I decided to get the hell away from the area and ran back home. The scariest part is that 5 minutes after I walk in the door, I hear the scream again. It was much closer and made my ears ring. Now that I think about it, I remember that I could hear my dad yell at me whenever I needed help with something every other time I was up there. I'm pretty sure it was where I was standing where I first saw it. My dad heard it too, so it wasn't just a hallucination. And my neighbor was talking about the screams a week after it happened. I've researched it as best I could, but I've never found anything except a description. I've never seen it since, and my dad hasn't either. One of the many reasons I moved in with my mum in Arizona. This didn't happen to me, but my boyfriend and his cousin. They were 17 and driving down this really dark road in a southwestern part of Arizona. It's a long stretch of road that was well known for not having any street lights, and it was surrounded by the local farmer's field. It had a huge canal that ran along the side of the street. There was also a very small town that connected to the west side of the streets to the south side of the streets, and it was named Santa Maria. Now my husband and I, who were both born and raised in Arizona, grew up close to this area. We'd heard about all the crazy stories and strange happenings, but crazy stories is all that we believed them to be. Especially because we drove up and down through this street almost every day, definitely every weekend, and always with our family as youngsters, then as teenagers looking for a spot to party or make out at. So with that being said, I just want to say I don't condone underage drinking. We were young and dumb, but now I'm a mum. Anyway, on this night my boyfriend and his cousin were sober. They had just left the south side and were now heading home. They were on the 67th Avenue and Lower Buckeye going west to 75th and Thomas Road when the car in front of them swerved crazily, and there wasn't any heavy traffic, but there was a car in front of them and one in the back. When the car in front of them swerved to the right, this is what they described. A lady in a white gown and a veil with no face was floating towards them. The cousin screamed to hit it. My boyfriend hit the gas fast, swerving to the right, causing them to almost crash into the canal. Neither of them looked back behind them into the mirrors. Then they sped all the way home, not saying a word. When they pulled into the driveway, his cousin jumped out the truck and ran inside, leaving him behind, and the passenger door swung wide open before he even put the truck in park. My boyfriend then ran inside too, frightened by what he'd just seen. They were both too scared to go out and check the bed of the truck or even go to close the door. To better understand, where we live there have been accounts of people seeing La Llorona, which is apparently what they think they've seen. Bear in mind I've been married to this man for over 20 years. He's a straight up guy and has only shared this story with me on several occasions. Each time I curiously ask what I think he saw, and he stares at me quietly and says, "Well, she was floating, because I didn't see her feet," which then tells me she probably wasn't human. I just want to let you know these guys aren't remotely cowardly, but something on that road scared the hell out of them. I used to own a horse boarding and training farm with about 45 acres surrounded by woods. I used to spend the night there quite a bit because I had to start chores early in the morning, so if I stayed up too late, it wasn't worth it to drive home. One night at about midnight, my dog started to bristle up and growl at the door of the office I slept in, and then my iPod, which I kept on a speaker in the middle of the barn, started blasting out Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire at full volume, which I definitely had not left on. Let me tell you, that song is freaky as hell in the middle of the night. Like wet your pants freaky. My dog was full on growling and barking at the door, so I cracked it to let him run out, figuring that if someone were in or around the barn, he'd get them. Anyone there would have had to have been trespassing at that time of night. After a few minutes, I went out of the office into the barn aisle with the bat to turn off the creepy music. The light I usually kept on so that I could see around was off, so it was pitch black in most of the barn. My dog was staring out the barn door, which I kept open in the summer to keep the horses cooler, as his hair bristled but wasn't leaving the barn, which he was allowed to do. I wrote it off as creepy as hell, but ultimately just was one of those things. You know, like it's weird and I can't explain it, but there's got to be a rational explanation that I simply don't know what it is. But the real scary part is that my property shared a private gate in the back with the property closest to mine, which had a gate at the back. Most of my property was fenced because of the horses, and the property next to mine was dozens of acres fenced with a chain link fence, which, if you know anything about rural fencing, is not done. Anyway, we found out later that the owner of the adjoining property was Todd Colep, the South Carolina serial killer. He had a woman chained up like a dog on his property, who he and his friends would abuse and walk around the property on a leash. He also had some of the remains of the people he buried on his property. He was doing all that stuff while I lived next to him. In fact, I used to ride on his property, but would always turn around if I heard machinery. In retrospect, it was probably burying things, or got the creeps, like something would tell me to turn around and go home. I was probably one of the few, if not only person beside his friends, to go on his property while all of that was going on. This story was told to me by a childhood friend's dad. Me and my friend had known each other for quite some time. Most of that time he lived in town. This town has a population of 8,000, literally in the dead center of Illinois. On the edge of town on a country highway, there's the remnants of a small pig farm and slaughterhouse, which is now run down, the land of which his family used to hunt on since the 80s. Cue our 8th grad year, and he tells me he's moving out to the country, to a new neighborhood that's being built, upscale homes, and his dad's been promoted at the local power plant. This was a mile from the farm/slaughterhouse. I start staying out at his house much more than usual because it was awesome. Lots of money had gone into it. We would explore the woods during the day, And this was around 98 to 99, and we would spend the nights inside listening to music and messing around with Yahoo chat groups. One day out in the woods, we came across a pond of a decent size. There's a small island in the middle. My friend sees this and immediately goes pale, telling me we've got to leave. We hightail it out of there without waiting for me, and I follow. I keep asking what's going on, but he won't tell me. We finally return to his parents' house and are sitting in the kitchen when we come in through the garage. They see his face and ask him what's wrong. He tells his dad he found the pond. His dad looks sick, and I again ask what the hell is going on. Now, his dad is a pretty straight-laced fellow. Not really a sense of humor to speak of since I met him, and would only enjoy a glass of expensive whiskey when he was in the mood. He decides now is one of these moods. After getting his glass and taking a few sips, he makes us promise to stay away from there and tells us this story. When he was younger, his dad took him and his brother to hunt out there. This incident happened when he was 19 and well seasoned. They got out early and decided to set up by this pond. Slow day, only a few deer that weren't really worth anything. Starting to get the idea of a new spot, they heard a rustling from outside the pond across from them. It was a wolf, but those aren't here. Not a thing in our area. At least not capable of walking to the pond. Looking at it like it was investigating, then stood up on its hind legs, walked that way into the water, swam to the middle, but walked up to the island on 2 legs, and it stood there before lying down and seemingly fell asleep. They decided to wait to make sure it was out, then slowly backed away, getting back to the truck as quick as possible, never going to hunt back there again. Again, this was told to me quite some time ago, but it always stuck with me. My friend's dad never joked with us. He never seemed to have much of a sense of humor at all. I spent a summer doing conservation work, out in the absolute middle of nowhere. I was part of a crew that would spend 2 weeks camping in remote places to do manual labor in places machines couldn't get to. We were building a new hiking/biking trail in the back portion of a designated wilderness area in a high-altitude desert. This means that the nearest civilization was a 2-hour car ride to a town of 41 people in a sandy soil area where tracks last forever. It was in the middle of our stint during the early part of the night, where everyone else had gone to bed, but I stayed up to read. It must have been around 11:30 or so, still pitch black outside, with clouds having covered the stars. My headlamp was probably the only light on a 40-mile radius. Suddenly, I hear footsteps walking around our camp, and head towards the tents from where I was in the community tent. The sound immediately put me on edge, as I felt the hair on my arms raise and my adrenaline spike. I recall thinking to myself that 2 things are very wrong, since the person was not using a light to see, and the footsteps were not coming towards me from the tents. Rather, it was the opposite. Within the 4 seconds it took me to drop my book, get up, and turn the corner of the tent to cast my light on the sleeping tents, the sound had stopped, but I saw tracks in the dirt before me. It looked like they came from one end of camp, looked in my tent, walked through the sleeping tents, and kept going again out of camp. I don't know if I was making too much noise or not by walking around, but the rest of my crew ended up waking up and asking me what was going on from inside their tents. After explaining what I found, they all got up to look at the boot prints in the dirt. They were damn near perfect copies of my own boots, except for one small thing. I had a rock stuck in my treads that were messing up the symmetry. I was wearing fairly common work boots, except I also happened to wear US size 15 double wide, so there's no way in hell this was one of the other crew members. I don't think any of us slept much that night. Never saw or heard anything more after the night. A light rain removed the tracks a few days later, but I do remember none of us were willing to step on the prints themselves and chose to step over them like cracks in the sidewalk. Me, my uncle, and my grandfather are all avid outdoorsmen. We've heard it all, including bobcats during mating season, which, if you haven't heard, sounds like a woman screaming. Quite honestly, this scared the crap out of me the first time I heard it when I was around 10, and honestly probably accounts for a lot of encounters that people claim to have out in the woods. As for my uncle, however, nothing ever phases him, and he's the most down-to-earth, no-nonsense outdoorsman I know, and has had many close encounters with black bears, bobcats, and even a cougar, and he always shares these tales with the younger kids at the bonfires. But one time he told me and my grandfather about something that he could not explain, something that chilled him straight to the bone and made him question how much he really does know about the woods. Now this takes place deep in the Appalachian Mountains, west of Boone, but I don't know the exact spot, as he would never say. Him and his buddy Brian were backpacking, as they had done many times before. He had a larger group that did this sort of thing every year, but this time it was just the two of them. Now this trail they are on is miles from any road, much less residency, and is not the sort of trail you would encounter other hikers on. This is pure wilderness. A few days into the hike, they set up camp overnight next to a stream they were following, cooked dinner, and then turned in their tents for the night. Sometime later, my uncle was awoken by something outside their camp. He listened intently, although he wasn't alarmed. Perhaps they had left food out, and a bear or raccoon had wandered up to snatch a quick bite. He then noticed that whatever was outside the tent was big, really big, and he could feel the impact of its feet hitting the ground. By now, he had grabbed his 44-point Magnum and laid it on his chest, just in case, of course. He still wasn't alarmed, as he had had many close encounters with bears before, and that's when he realized it. In the dead of the night, there were no sounds, and the woods were oddly quiet, and he could hear the individual footsteps, and they were only two. Whatever was outside his tent was not walking on four legs, but two. At this point, he starts getting genuinely scared as the footsteps get closer and closer to the tent. He could now hear the heavy, raspy breaths of the creature, almost like a grunting sound that it took with each step. By now, his firearm was pointed right in the direction of the noise. He had no clue as to the height of the creature, but he could tell it was big, like a 300-pound man walking through his camp. And then he heard the creature simply slowly walk back into the woods going upstream, and heard the leaves rustle a bit as it entered back into the forest. And then the return of silence. Upon waking up the next day, he thought he may have dreamt it, when Brian came running up to him asking if he had heard whatever the hell was outside their camp that night. They immediately looked for tracks, but found nothing. The story doesn't end there, however. Sometime later, they went backpacking again around the same area, although not exactly the same. They were all sitting around the campfire when they heard a pack of coyotes howling, which is not uncommon in that part of the state. They were listening to the symphony when out of nowhere came a deadening noise that echoed all through the valley. He described it as if a really big 200-pound muscular man had taken a baseball bat and slammed it against a tree as hard as he could. The forest immediately went silent, and not a single coyote howl or yip was heard again for the rest of the night. Now, my uncle was dead serious when he was telling me this story, and isn't the type to make up stories to sound cool. It's really against his character, and I believed every word he said. My grandfather offered little to no insight as to what it could have been. As for me, it does sound a lot like the other Bigfoot stories I've read online, especially for knocking. What do you guys think? I'd love to hear your own ideas. I am an avid hunter in a rural town in Missouri My family hunts on public land, and we have hunted on the same ridge for multiple generations. The land used to be kept by a large sawmill that used mules to drag the trees to the mill in the nearby town. We have found all sorts of crazy stuff: railroad spikes in the middle of the woods, horseshoes grown into the side of trees where they hung it on a limb. One of the craziest things I found in the woods was where a wagon had fallen off the side of a ridge, taking the mules with it. It's something like a 200-foot drop, so they just left everything down there. I've hiked by this thing hundreds of times, and from our hunting spot, the woods all rotted from it, but the metal brackets and wheels were still there, grown over and taken back by nature. One day while walking in the woods, I get to my spot that's probably half a mile from that spot that I've been sitting for the past few hours, when I hear what sounds like people yelling down the ridge, followed by a loud scream and a huge crashing sound. So I grabbed my gear and started to make my way out. When I get to where the wagon debris was, there was a flower wreath laid over the wagon, but I've never seen anyone down there except my family members, and no one knows who might have put it there. We talked about that night back at camp, and we could only assume that if someone had passed in that wagon, maybe it was some distant grandchild or something, and that day was the anniversary of it happening. But that still doesn't explain the sound that I heard. I'm still hunting in the same place, but I've never heard or seen anything since. I was in Southeast Alaska for around 15 days a few summers ago. We had just finished up dinner and washed out our pots and pans, and had gone into our respective tents in the trees along the shore that we had stopped at for the night. The spot we had chosen to camp at wasn't ideal. The tide was said to come in pretty far that night and would only leave us with a few feet before the water would be lapping up at our tent flaps. But we also didn't care that much, as it had been raining and incredibly windy that day, so kayaking was hardly any fun at all, and we needed to stop. About 45 minutes after we said goodnight to one another, I heard some splashing in the tidal zone, probably 20 feet from my tent. I didn't think much of it because a few times before, when in Alaska, we had stopped at beaches where the tide had risen within a few feet of our tents. I tried to ignore it, although in my mind I'm freaking out. Our camp spot was less than ideal if you wanted to escape in the middle of the night. We were at the base of a relatively steep hill that was covered in alders and slick with rain. To the left, probably 70 feet of where we camped, there was a rocky outcrop that went out into the water and was about 20 feet tall and steep enough that you couldn't climb it. For example, a grizzly bear, and there were lots out in the summer, we had seen 4 or 5 times that day alone patrolling the beaches. It wanted to see what was going on down the beach and walked towards us from the right, and it would basically seal off our movement, sort of like putting the cork back in a wine bottle. Not many places to go. After 15 minutes of hearing splashing, I start to try and rationalize, enough to go to sleep. But that's when I start hearing something other than splashing. This incredibly high-pitched gargling sound breaks through the night's relatively quiet air. It sounded as though 2 cats had gotten into a fight, but every time they let out a scream, the other cat would push one cat's head underwater. This went on for a good 20 minutes. After it died down, I hear, "That's weird, huh?" from the other tent, obviously trying to downplay the incident. I, being scared as hell, just reply, "Yep, gonna sleep." 15 minutes pass without as much of a sound, but then the same gargling breaks through the night, this time much closer. The noises are deeper this time, more guttural. It sounds like an old man fighting with a cat, and each time each of them shriek, they are forced underwater. The splashing intensifies, and it sounds like it's coming from right outside my tent. I think that the fear of whatever was going on eventually just zapped me of all my energy, because eventually I fell asleep. I just remember that I didn't move a muscle, and I didn't move for so long that all of my muscles ached after a while, and I could feel my heart beat in my throat all night long. We woke up, had breakfast, broke down the tents, and got back on the road. Didn't hear it ever again. A few weeks later I did some Googling, and I'm pretty sure it was just sea otters fighting each other in the intertidal zone. But it was scary as hell. I was at my girlfriend's house for the weekend, which is usually every Friday to Sunday, and in of itself isn't that unusual. We both recently started college. She still lives with her parents and 2 younger brothers. It was about 4:50 in the morning, and this is when the creepy stuff began. You see, everyone else in the house was asleep, except for us. We love staying up late to play video games or watch films. We just finished watching a movie, in fact, and were preparing to go to sleep. I was getting changed into shorts and a shirt to sleep, and my girlfriend went to the kitchen to get us both a glass of water, since her room can get very hot and stuffy during the summer. After getting changed, I was chilling on the beanbag in her room, waiting for her to return. At this point, it's important to understand the basic layout of where she lives, otherwise this next part might be slightly confusing. So her house is about 8 minutes outside the city limits, and she has a long driveway that goes from the road up a hill that leads to her house. Her house is surrounded by trees and fairly dense forest, and her nearest neighbors are a good couple of minutes away. At the end of her driveway is a motion sensor that, when activated by movement, then makes 3 loud beeps inside her home. Her dad is a fairly high-ranking military man, so he definitely takes precautions and safety measures to ensure his family's safety. And like I said before, she was in the kitchen alone at around 4 a.m, while I am still in her bedroom. Her kitchen is down the hallway and through the living room from where her bedroom is, so she should be back within a minute or 2. She was just taking at least triple the usual amount of time, and right before I was going to head into the kitchen to check on her, she walked around the corner with a worried look on her face. She can be spooked pretty easily, so I wasn't alarmed at first. She handed me the water and then started to explain quickly why she had taken so long. She'd pretty much said that she was in the kitchen, in the sink, filling up the water, when she heard a whining sound coming outside the 2 windows near the sink. She figured it was one of her 2 dogs and decided to go to the garage to check on them. They were both curled up in their kennels when she opened the door, asleep, and had only just been woken up by her turning on the light to see them. She told me at that point she was pretty confused and slightly uneasy. She walked back into the kitchen and heard this really deep, weird bark coming again from somewhere outside the kitchen windows. And please note that it was 4 a.m, so it's nearly pitch black outside, especially since the dense trees around their house block up plenty of moonlight. She told me she couldn't see anything and hurried back to the room to tell me. I was slightly skeptical at first, since I assumed it was just the dogs and that my girlfriend was really tired and tripping out, so I agreed to follow her back to the kitchen. At first I heard nothing for a good 2 minutes and decided to try and recreate what she had done. I walk in, turn on the sink and wait. Another 2 minutes go by and I hear the same freaky whining sound coming from outside the window. It sounded so much like a wounded animal. I had to turn on the lights on the garage again, which was slightly lighting up the area outside the window, but I couldn't see a sign of animals or anything. She switched off the light, and then we heard the whining sound grow further away, almost as if the creature had fled up the hill near the kitchen and towards the forest. That was when we realized that it was scared or sensitive to the lights, so we left the kitchen and returned to her room. At this point I was pretty spooked, and I wanted to make sure that whatever it was had been scared off for good. So we go back into the kitchen, and after a few minutes, both armed with decently sized knives that my girlfriend has in her room for protection. 5 minutes go by in the kitchen, and it's silent. But then the whining starts up again, and a weird, sad barking sound, like something imitating an injured animal, was maybe 10 feet outside the kitchen windows. And at that moment I realized something. There's no reason for some creature to try and imitate an injured animal's sound unless it wanted to lure us out and cause us harm. I get slightly annoyed at it and start to yell at it to go away, and everything falls silent. Then I hear movement outside the window and a weird sound, almost as if something was moving alongside the wall right under the window. Then, whatever it was lets out this unnatural sound, almost like a groan and a growl. My girlfriend and I looked at each other and sprinted out the kitchen without a word. We hid in her room until we passed out at 5 or 6 a.m. We had talked it over, listened to a ton of animal noises, and not a single one got anywhere close to the final unnatural sound. I wouldn't even be able to accurately mimic the sound. It was so eerie and haunting, and I can still hear it in my head. So we did some research the next day, and there are a few known possibilities that we came up with. Perhaps a Wendigo, skinwalker, I don't know, maybe even something else. We looked around outside in the morning, and there was no blood and no tracks, so definitely no injured animal. However, on the hill about 10 feet in front of the kitchen window, we saw 2 heavy indents on the ground and then flattened grass leading up. We decided to tell one of my girlfriend's brothers about this experience so that he could help test something. We had one person go inside the kitchen sink near the windows and the other walk around in various places near the windows making sounds to try and triangulate where the creature had been standing. We concluded it was at one point no more than 5 feet from the windows, and then at another point it fled up the hill, which matched with the trampled grass and indents leading up the hill. Farther up the hill there's a path that branches, and another part of the path is fairly abandoned and overgrown. Nobody has walked there in at least 2 years, and I followed it to the end and kept going a little further looking for tracks. I did manage to find something interesting. A 3-foot-tall fern and brambles almost completely flattened, and a few twigs snapped perfectly in half as if something decently large had walked through the area in a hurry, and it seemed very recent. We then decided to tell my girlfriend's parents about it, and her dad seemed especially interested in it. He told us that the wood panels on the pump house had been torn off within the last few days. He then took one of the dogs into the woods, and we assume he checked for any signs. He returned and about 2 days later installed a camera right next to the kitchen window where we heard the sounds. And again, he's a pretty high-ranking military man, and he 100% believes that there was something going on that night. If anyone has any thoughts or input, I'd appreciate it. I worked in a kennels up in the mountains. In the depths of winter, it would be dark by 5 p.m. I'd be in the office finishing up some paperwork. At this stage, everyone would be gone, and this particular building was a bit far away from the main building and car park. All the dogs would be sleeping by this time after a busy day. You could hear a pin drop. Sometimes, I would hear definite, slow footsteps, so much so that I would get up, come out to the main front, ready to explain that we were closed but no one would be there. It used to freak me out. A few times I would even check the dogs in case it was coming from the kennels, but they were all sound asleep. Before I get to this story, I'd like to point out that I'm not from America, which is surprisingly in contrast of what people often think. I'm from the Netherlands, and due to the kind of mentality I was raised with, I would have never even dared to think about the existence of supernatural creatures here. Personally, I've always been on the fence about these kind of things, unsure What stories are legends and just superstitions, and which ones hold more truth than fantasy? The typical Dutch mentality I've been raised with is that there's nothing more to the world than what we've already discovered. At least not in terms of the divine, the paranormal, and the supernatural. At least, that's what I had originally thought. But as it often does, the world tends to show us her truths in one form or another. I was born in Holland, the Midwest of the country, but moved to Brabant, the Middle South, at a young age. There's nothing out of the ordinary about my home, but I'm happy to say there's quite a big forest just a few kilometers south of where I live. I'd often, and still do, go on long walks and relaxing hikes there. I would often go off trail occasionally and go on nightly walks in the summer, all illegally, since here we have strict laws that say nobody is allowed to either camp, go off trail, or be in the forest at night. Needless to say, I deliberately stayed in the forest until after sunset, secretly risking a fine. I'd often wear dark clothes to go out into the forest so that the service men and women and the late night lurkers would be unable to spot me. I don't know why I'm addicted to these hikes in the forest, especially the nocturnal ones. I've always felt a really strong call of the wild, since the first time I went off trail in the summer of 2017, when I'd visit the woods either going off trail or not even the time of day would matter. I'd get energetic and excited about it. I would even dare to say that I wanted to go hunting at some point, when I'd see a deer or rabbit nearby. Unfortunately, I don't have a license or the weapons, so I'm pretty sure I wouldn't catch anything. Anyway, months ago at the start of autumn, I went for another night hike in the forest. I had to bring my flashlight since it was cloudy and rainy outside. As always, I went there on my mountain bike, chaining it to a pole before I'd set off into the darkness between the trees. I saw just the last people walking back to their cars and homes, as I was walking in the opposite direction. It was getting completely dark when I reached the middle point of the forest. You can call me a hippie, I don't mind. Frankly, I would have done so myself if I'd read a similar story. Now, before I get to the actual encounter, I must say that I have already encountered something similar in the woods of January of 2017. I went to the forest during the day since the winter's first snow had fallen during the night, and I wanted to go and take some photographs of the beautiful snowy landscape. Though I stayed a bit too long, it had gotten dark and I'd had to be back at my bike and out the woods. So hurrying back is when I heard a loud crunch coming from the bushes, as if something big, like a deer, was running along the trees. The sound was distant at first, but soon it got closer, until indeed I did see a deer speed out of the snow-covered depths of the forest across the path I was on. Though, hot on its heels, raced something different. This huge, wolf-like creature, clearly bigger than a regular wolf. This one was at least a meter high at the shoulder. It looked slightly sturdier than a regular timber wolf, with dark, shaggy fur looking at its face. I could see its teeth and its paws. They were much larger to that of a normal wolf. Now please note that back in 2017, wolves were only just returning to the Netherlands, mostly roaming the border with Germany, and eventually settling in our biggest national park, which was located more than 100 kilometers away from my place. Plus, there hadn't been any wolves spotted in this area yet, so it was pretty much impossible for me to believe this was just an ordinary wolf. Only looking at the sheer size of it already. I would have taken a picture of it if only I could have. Everything happened so fast. I saw the deer and the wolf cross the trail within a time span of 5 seconds at most before they vanished into the dark. Still awestruck and a little unsettled by now, knowing there was a huge canine roaming the woods, I went over to look at possible tracks it might have left behind. It did, but with every gallop it must have kicked up lots of dirt in the air, since there were no paw prints, only claw marks, and then patches of dirt missing. Though those marks were still as big as my hand with my fingers spread out. Feeling frightened and still processing that I'd just seen a gigantic wolf hunt down its prey, I marched over to my bike as fast as I could, unlocked it, jumped on it, and rode away. before it decided to change its mind and make me its meal instead. That's when I heard a sinister deep howl coming from the woods, like a wolf's howl, but in some way deeper and more haunting. Of course, I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, especially since I didn't have enough evidence to support my claim. But I wasn't afraid of going back to the woods, not even at night, since I knew wolves generally aren't afraid of humans. And when I did go back, by the time of my second encounter, I'd almost forgotten about the beast that calls the forest its home. The summer of 2019, I returned for a nightly walk after having done the occasional hikes during the day. I didn't bring my camera with me this time, I just wanted to go for a refreshing full moon walk. After about half hour of walking deep into the woods, and after having set myself down on a wooden bench, I heard the faint bleating of a sheep from about 300 meters away. I stood up and started to go in the direction of the noise, mostly because the bleating sounded rather distressed, as if the sheep were panicking or trying to flee from something. I was already surprised that I could hear it from so far away, but what surprised me more was that I was able to smell something metallic as well. It was like a coppery scent, very strong, and that's when I figured it must be the smell of blood. The wind was blowing in my direction, but still I didn't know I was capable of this. The flock was placed on a small moor about 300 meters from where I was seated on the bench. It took me some time walking towards the pen before I could see the sheep, as they were hidden by trees and bushes. When I arrived at the pen, something unexpected shocked me. Not only were the animals running around frantically and trying to escape, but there had been 2 sheep slaughtered lying there in a puddle of blood, their throats torn open by powerful jaws and ferocious claws, judging from the looks of the deep gashes in the skin and bite marks on their neck. There were a scramble of enormous lupine paw prints around the sheep's corpses and around their makeshift enclosure. It seemed as if the killer was meticulous about choosing its prey before stepping inside to make a move. After the victims had been selected, the results were clear to see. This monstrous beast threw caution to the wind, just as it had done to the sheep's innards. To most, it was a horrendous sight, but I found it more curious than anything else. The first thing I felt was frustration, that something was roaming around the woods near my home. I followed the tracks, hoping to find what made them before whatever it was found me. As I got deeper into the woods, the foliage became denser and harder to navigate. It was just that dark. Thinking quickly, I turned on my flashlight and shone it around the shadows cast by the moonlight, creating eerie shapes and figures. Suddenly, I heard muffled footsteps from around me. A branch snapped from behind me, and without thinking, I shone my light towards where I'd heard it. Dark yellow eyes about 4 feet above the ground reflected back at me from the shadows. As soon as the beast had stepped out from the cover of the shadows, and when I came face to face with it, I froze. It was, from a few quick looks of it, the same animal I'd seen 2.5 years ago. It had the same build, the same dark shaggy fur. The animal appeared to be staring at me cautiously, its gaze hard and cold, but it didn't seem to be aggressive. From the blood on its snout, I could tell that this must have been the beast that killed those sheep, and now I was indeed scared, on the edge, and cautious. It's not like I stood much of a chance against a wolf like this, with its huge teeth and claws, but my instincts told me to fight rather than flee if need be. After all, if I ran, I'd pretty much give myself away as prey for the animal if it was still hungry. Plus, these woods were mine, and the beast was an intruder, and I'd be damned if I let an intruder trespass on my home. The beast was still watching me, and as it did so, it rose onto its hind legs. Thankfully, no signs of aggression were visible. Despite that, I took a defensive stance, broadening my shoulders and appearing as big as I possibly could. The creature approached, It was now standing about 5 meters away, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand as it bowed forward a little, sniffing the air. It then perked up its ears, twitched them about, as if it was reconsidering going after me. And despite how standoffish I chose to appear, and how I may act in my day-to-day life, I couldn't even come close to how intimidating and well-built this thing was, how large it was, and when compared to, well, how minuscule I am, I shrank inside. The wolf stepped back, breaking eye contact as it sniffed the air and looked around. I took a tiny step forward, attempting to scare it off, as I once again tried to look as defensive and territorial as I felt in that moment. I decided to take my chances. It was now or never, so breathing in deeply and with my most intimidating voice, I shouted, "Get out now." In Dutch, of course. The beast acted surprised, startled even, as if it hadn't even expected me to speak or be this defensive. It then let out a growl, and after that it got down on all fours and vanished into the foliage. Soon as I could no longer see or hear it, I let out a sigh of relief so loud that I was still afraid. That thing could hear me, and worse, it could return. My feet had gone numb as the adrenaline left my body, and I was quaking as the cold air finally started to nip at me. A loud, distant howl echoed from behind me, and as it rang through the night, the fear grew inside me. It howled again, and I started to head back to my bike, swiftly jogging for what seemed like hours, continuously checking every sound I heard, keeping my eyes wide open, like a startled deer, and never failing to look around me in case the monster had other plans. After making it back to my bike, I quickly unlocked it and raced home, breaking what must have been the world's record for fastest speed pedaled, and once I arrived, the realization hit me that I had very likely been staring death in the face. It made yet another cold shiver go down my spine. To relax, I had a drink, sat down on the couch, and as I sat down with a drink in hand, staring into the fireplace, the questions started pouring at me. Why didn't it attack me? Why did it leave? Stranger still, how is something that big? Not to mention how it hasn't been reported in the local news. How has no one caught it on camera? And if they have, were they silenced by the media? Were they laughed at, mocked, ostracized? I had all these questions, but no way of finding any answers. Moreover, was it even what I thought it was? Was the creature perhaps a dire wolf of some kind that was only thought to have gone extinct in prehistoric times? There had to be a logical explanation after all. Time moved on, weeks became months, and I never told a soul about my encounter. Since then, cattle mutilations have been reported. Strange and large animal tracks have been documented. People say it's a bear or a ravenous pack of wolves, but these stories only come up the night after a full moon, they say. There have even been multiple reportings of sheep massacres around the south and east of the country that have been confirmed to have been committed by a wolf. I've been back to these woods since, but only in the day. But even then, I still felt off, like I was being watched and unwelcome. My two encounters did make me dive into Dutch and European folktales and legends about werewolves. And to summarize what I found, European timber wolves are said to have been the most bold and aggressive in the world. All I can say for certain is that no matter how unbelievable it sounds, always give a little bit of trust towards the old stories you're told, because you may just be encountering something straight out of fantasy, only to leave your survival, your life to fate. And if you should ever find yourself in the Netherlands, especially in the woods on a full moon at night, you best hope that thing you hear howling off in the distance is a lot further than you think to be, because there's no telling what might happen if the two of you meet. Good luck, and have a good night. I once had an encounter with the trailside killer in Northern California in the late 70s while I was hiking with a friend. I came across him at a rocky outcrop on Mount Tam. He gave off a very discomforting vibe, and we didn't hang around. The encounter was short. We attempted to exchange a few pleasantries, as one does when seeing someone at a good resting spot. But it was weird, and the entire thing felt off. So my buddy and I opted to keep walking, and we did. We just got the wrong vibes from that guy. But strange enough that it stuck with both of us. That was until a few years later, and his picture shows up in the paper. If I'd have been with my girlfriend, we may not have made it out of there alive. Who knows? This was when I was about 13. I was at church camp, which had a cliff nearby. Of course, my 2 tent mates and I snuck out during the middle of the night to go see the stars. It was a magnificent view. We were all from the city, so being in the middle of the forest was exciting, since we couldn't see many stars at home. So we hiked the mile to the cliff and stand there for a few minutes in silence. Across the valley I see a light on the mountain. I assumed it was a car because it was going sideways, like it was on a road, but then it started to go straight down the mountain, which would have been impossible for a car because no roads go straight down it. The light started to speed up and was heading right towards us. The light made it to the bottom of the huge mountain within 2 to 3 minutes. It must have been going at least 70 miles per hour. We all stood our ground, not saying a word. When it got to the valley, it went even faster and was still coming right towards us. We saw it still only had one massive light instead of 2 like a car, and it was huge. I don't think a dirt bike could have had that big of a light, even in the dark. The moon was so bright you could have gotten away with no headlights. We finally ran when it got 3/4 of the way across the valley. It was strangely terrifying. Once the light appeared there was a heavy feeling of horror that we only spoke about once. One friend thought it was so scary, she pushed us down to get by us while we were running up the hill on our way to camp. In the morning we told the grown-ups about it and they didn't really believe us. One said there was a sighting of a strange man who was snooping around, so the light was a warning to get back to camp. I suppose being a mile away in the dark as 13-year-olds is pretty dangerous. I don't believe in ghosts and spirits, and it could have just been a dirt bike or something, but I haven't felt that amount of terror since. In middle school, I worked at the school during the summer, doing general painting and helping the maintenance guys. We had to drive out to the middle of the Floridian forest to pick up some pine lumber for the gym's new bleachers. And when we got to the mill at 7 a.m., the whole place was locked down with police. They had found gasoline cans and pill bottles out in one of the farm groves, telltale signs of kids abusing substances, but supposedly the cops were there because they found human remains. I was pretty young and don't remember anything outside of my little kid point of view, but I remember seeing dark streaks of blood running up the trunks of several pines. I've since learned from the guys I was with then that a teenager had his life ended by a bear after attacking it, and the blood was either from the wounded bear climbing a tree or dragging a hurt person up with it. But I'm sure you can agree with me that bears don't do that, and I can't see an injured bear making up several pines in a row while bleeding to that. So technically I saw a creepy thing while working in a remote area. Look up Lakeland Mill casualties or something to find it. The story of the kids passing was in the local paper. So I live in a somewhat medium-sized town, with a mix of cities and backwoods areas. A bus stop I usually use is a good mix. It has buildings close by while also having entryways into the nearby surrounding woods. One morning I was waiting for the bus when I realized it was late that morning. I got annoyed and decided since I was bored, I would go into this little walkway/trail that was nearby. Not all the way, just enough to where I could be secluded by the trees. After a while of checking my phone, I heard the bus stop at the stop a little way down from mine. I headed back to the stop, so I got there and got a fight or flight response that was very intense, almost as if a firearm had been shot off. I turn around to see this crouching creature coming out of the secluded area I was just in. It's pitch dark. Its arms were about the size of half its body. Its head looked like an unused eraser, and the most terrifying part of it was its size. It was easily the size of a telephone or lamp pole. It towered over me and everything around it. Its hands were large and its fingers were thick, and were about the size of half my arm. I didn't know if I should run because I knew this thing could catch me in a few strides. Some time passed while it climbed out the walkway and stood looking at me. Then the bus pulled up and opened its doors. I looked at the bus and back at the creature, but it was gone. Vanished. I looked at the bus driver and his face was normal. I assumed he hadn't actually seen anything. I got on the bus and silently cried for a few minutes. I don't know if this is correlated or not, or if it's just my brain, but that night I had a dream where the exact same thing happened, except the bus didn't show up, and that thing tore me to pieces. My friend called it the Line Man, but I don't care about naming it. I went back to the bus stop over the course of the next few weeks, and every time I do, I always check to see if it's there. And it happened again. Once while walking back from church, in a side facing the mountain, I got the same fight or flight response and I stood still. And then I looked to my left, where the thing's giant hand was sitting. It noticed me, so it moved out of the brush towards me, but I ran, and I saw it stand, and it was easily as tall as the church. I ran around, got my car and drove off. I then contemplated what would have happened to me had I not run. The other story is from last night. I was trying to sleep, but I kept on waking up because my heart would beat intensely, giving me an adrenaline rush. Not only that, but I heard banging vibrations and twigs snapping from the back of my property. I got up and looked out my window when I saw something that kept me up for the rest of the night. On my roommate's car was a muddy/rainy handprint bigger than my torso. That morning I got up and went to the bus stop and saw two more things that have stuck with me since. I saw a giant footprint easily about the size of half my body. I also saw my neighbor wailing over the fact that the apparent storm had ripped one of her trees out the ground. But I don't think this was the storm. This isn't fiction, and I actually don't know what to do. I was hiking in a state park with a friend once, about a half-mile away from the trail, and 5 miles from the trail's start. That's where we found a woman's blouse, some jeans that were ripped from the zipper to the crotch, and a pair of underwear. It all looked super dirty, like it had been there for a really long time. It really freaked me out, especially because it wasn't the type of clothes you would wear for a few miles hike. We reported it to the ranger station, and they said they would check it out, but I'm not sure if they ever did. When I got home, I looked for any crimes in the area in the past couple of years, but couldn't find anything. I haven't been back to those woods without a group since. Who knows? There could be some darker secret still lurking in that woods, waiting to be discovered. I fly helicopters over power lines in remote parts of the country. I once saw what I thought was a human leg sticking out of the woods in a very small clearing in the trees. It shook me enough that I went back to the location and got some of the ground crewmen to go back and look while I hovered as low as I could without hitting the rotors on the trees. When we get there, he says he can't exactly see what it is. We go back and grab a pair of binoculars so that he can get a closer look. Turns out it was a cow. The catch was that it had no skin, none at all. A perfect cow without any of its skin. No animal had eaten it yet, so it was still fully intact. There were no farms around for a 50-mile radius, and I still have no clue how it ended up there in the manner that it was. I still remember the, "Geez, that's a body," feeling I had when I think of this story. I used to work for an IT company in the gaming industry, whose office was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by farms and forest. One day, one of the development team had come in from a walk in the forest and was visibly upset. Turns out she came across a dead fox. The thing that was concerning is that she said it was hanging from a tree and looked like it was put there on purpose. So a bit later on, a few of us went down to have a look. We came across a small clearing with the dead fox hanging there. Upon closer inspection, we realized it had been hung by its neck, with an incision from its balls to its throat, and all of its insides had been pulled out. We felt pretty sick from that one. We got it down from the branch and chucked it into the bushes away from the path and clearing. Still to this day, I have no idea why or how it was in that state. I was 22 when this happened, 2 years ago. My name's Grisha, and for the past 5 or 6 years I've only had 2 friends who have stuck around with me through thick and thin. We live within 5 minutes of each other, in a rural area in southwest Ohio, specifically in the hills of the Ohio River Valley. My friends are called Garrett and Oscar, and my brother, who is part of our friend group, is called Chris. Garrett and Oscar are actually next door neighbors. They both live on decently sized plots of land that they don't actually own. There's lots of farmland and thick forest, and behind Garrett's house are a few small ponds that we used to fish in. His house was pretty small and not in the best condition, and Oscar lived in a medium-sized brick house. We would usually go to Oscar's place to hang out during summer, since his parents were always at camp, and Garrett's house or my house during the other seasons. This is somewhat relevant, but mostly for setup. Like I said, this happened about 2 years ago. Now, one thing you need to know about us is that we are firearm enthusiasts. So when one of my buddies called me and told me he brought a new rifle, I knew we were gonna go shooting before the day was over. I grabbed my own firearms, as did Chris. We jumped in the Jeep and drove over to Oscar's house. It was still early, about 3 in the afternoon, and less than 5 minutes after we'd pulled in, a black Chevy Impala pulled into the driveway, heralding Garrett's arrival. He bought his rifle and pistol as well. We shot for a few hours, taking pot shots at wooden targets Oscar had built in his backyard, and we'd burnt through a pretty large chunk of ammo. I decided I wanted to get something to drink, so I jumped in the Jeep and drove for about 10 minutes to the closest gas station. After getting to the gas station and grabbing a few cans of the Nectar of the Gods, by which of course I mean Monster, I headed back to my friend's house. When I came back, I saw all 3 of them standing by the door at the side of the house. Oscar had a very uneasy look on his face. We jumped out the Jeep and walked over and asked him what was going on. "We heard some weird stuff in the woods a few minutes ago," Garrett told me. I asked him what he was talking about, and what he meant by weird stuff. They began to explain that they heard some sort of loud vocalization that sounded between a coyote's yelping and a howl. None of us had any idea what it could have been, so we opted to forget about it. We went inside and decided to play some games, and after a few hours I became bored and started browsing 4chan on my phone and lost track of time. It was getting late. Garrett had walked outside to smoke a cigarette. Oscar was in the toilet, and Chris's girlfriend came and collected him. Oscar's dog started to bark all of a sudden, and it startled me. I heard Garrett coming back inside the house rather quickly and asked him what was going on and if something was wrong. "Step outside and check for yourself," he told me. I came out, curious about what the dogs were barking at, and the second I opened the door, the smell hit me. It was the worst smell I'd ever smelt in my life. Imagine the smell of a wet dog, the smell of a dead deer rotting in the sun, and the smell of landfill. combined. That's the best way I can describe it. Repulsed by the stench, I went back inside and told Garrett I can see why he came in so quickly. The dogs were barking, and they appeared to be getting more aggressive. When Oscar finally came out the bathroom, wondering what the commotion was about, Garrett explained the smell, and Oscar seemed more curious than anything. He was also angry, thinking someone was trespassing. He grabbed his firearms and walked out to look around. He told us to stay inside until he returned. Not thinking much of it, we agreed and I began browsing 4chan. I was startled when I heard the sound of a dog yelp, followed by 5 shots in rapid succession. A few minutes later, Oscar burst through the door, instructed us to grab our own firearms, and that there's some tall dude in a ghillie suit that just ended the life of one of his dogs. We grabbed our firearms and followed him outside, staying close the entire time. Sure enough, in the backyard, we found one of his dogs. The throat was ripped. This wasn't a small dog either, it was a large poodle mix of some kind, one of the really big ones. Close by, we saw the other dog, cowering in his house. The cows in the pasture on the other side of the road were mooing as if they were both afraid and agitated, and I asked Oscar to explain what was going on, and he told me that on the other side of the barn, where he heard the dog yelp, he rounded the corner and saw a figure that looked like a big guy in a ghillie suit running towards the woods. He shot at him, hoping to hit his leg and incapacitate him, but he knew he didn't. The same smell he described earlier was hanging in the air, but it was faint. Garrett and Oscar had flashlights on their rifles, and I had one on my pistol, so I slung my rifle over my back, drew my pistol, and we fanned out to search the area. I wasn't expecting to find anything. I could see Garrett heading to the other edge of the property, and Oscar was moving towards the cow pasture. I headed back towards the barn, and as I started to step in, I lit a cigarette when I felt raindrops hit me. I stepped into the barn to smoke, stood there for under a minute when I heard another shot coming from the direction Garrett went. I started going that way and saw Oscar heading there too. While we were making our way, Garrett fired 3 more shots. "What are you shooting at?" I asked. "I saw the dude, but..." Oscar's voice was shaky and hushed. "It didn't look like a guy." Garrett took a heavy gulp and continued to explain. "It looked like a big dog or a wolf. I could clearly see its muzzle and ears, and I saw it standing behind some bushes, but it was on its hind legs." He stopped, pulled out a cigarette, hands quivering, but still managed to light it. "I reckon it must have been about 6 feet tall," he went on to say. "What are you even talking about? You know there aren't any wolves around here and coyotes aren't that big. You think a coyote would have had the guts to come up and rip my dog's throat? We've got to be dealing with some pelt-wearing hermit strung out on meth or something." My friend went on to explain he sized up the height by taking reference to a nearby tree that was about 350-ish feet away. So we all walked over to see what he was talking about, and then the rain started to pick up, and the wind was getting strong as well. The clap of thunder put us all on edge, and sure enough, once we reached the tree, which was a large maple, the branch he used to determine the size was close to 8 feet off the ground by our estimate. We decided to put the other dog in the garage and keep it safe from whoever or whatever was messing with us. The dog was inside a small kennel, but if you live in a rural area, you know that junkies always manage to find their way to break into places they shouldn't be. We all went back to the house, locked the dog in, and stayed there. "Should we just leave? We can just crash at Grish's house until morning," Garrett said. I reminded him that Chris and his girlfriend were there, and his face instantly turned to one of disgust. We all hated Chris's girlfriend because she was really annoying, and none of us wanted to deal with her, so we unanimously decided to hunker down with our weapons and stay awake on shifts. It was past midnight at this point, and I volunteered to take first shift until around 2 a.m, while the other 2 lads passed out. I sat there watching the window and became bored after the adrenaline wore off. I reached into my backpack, and pulled out a finely crafted Gurkha cigar and stepped out on the back porch, lit it, and began to unwind. I stood there for about 10 minutes when I heard the cows begin to make more noise, and I could hear the other dog barking aggressively inside the garage. I became on edge again, and sat my cigar in the ashtray, and unslung my rifle and held it on with the safety off. I made sure not to stray too far from the porch light, but I got far enough into the field to see movement in the tree line. I couldn't see what it was, but in a gap in the trees and undergrowth I saw quick flashes of a grey figure. I began feeling uneasy, so I started backing to the house. I could hear rustling over the breeze. It sounded like it was moving towards me, and I pointed my rifle in that direction. I had 10 shots to defend myself before I would reach for my pistol if something were happening. The rustling stopped. I still couldn't see anything. I was around halfway between the porch and the tree line, and time just felt like it stopped. I felt like I was standing there for hours. I turned and ran, hearing something burst out of the undergrowth behind me. I reached the back door, threw it open, struggling to catch my breath due to years of smoking. Garrett and Oscar had woken up. Garrett's shift started soon, and I told them about what happened, and they told me to go lie down for a bit. When I woke up, we would all sit up until sunrise. I lay down on the couch and managed to somehow doze off, and was awoken not long after by Garrett shaking me. "We've got to go now," he said in a panicked tone. "Oscar went outside half-hour ago and he still isn't back yet." I was still half asleep, so it took a moment to sink in. "Oscar's gone?" I asked, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I sat up and asked him to explain. We heard the cows outside acting annoyed, but then they started to sound like they were scared, and some of them managed to trample through the fence. Oscar went to see what scared them and told me that if he wasn't back in 10 to call the cops. By now I was lacing my boots up. "Forget that," I said. "Oscar's a brother. We can't just leave him out there. We're going to go find him." I agreed without hesitation. We grabbed all our arsenal and headed out, locked the door behind us, and I could see the spot in the fence where the cows had broken through. We crossed the road and walked into the pasture. This pasture's huge. Part of it is just grass, but it also has small ponds, but most of it is a forest. Flat forest. The kind with not much undergrowth and where the trees are spaced out more. A great place for cattle and a great place to hunt too. If I had to guess, I would say at least 200 acres. Garrett used to hunt on this farmer's land too. He was leading the way when we heard a long string of rapid fire, followed by a short pause, followed by 9 more shots. It was clearly Oscar, emptying out his arm, grabbing his pistol and emptying it out too. We ran in that direction even though it sounded far away, and we reached the wooded part of the property and called Oscar's name. We kept making our way to the direction we heard the shots, and panic began to set in with each passing moment. Garrett was losing his cool, and I wasn't far behind. He suddenly fired off a shot and began sprinting. "There he is, that's gotta be him," he was yelling. I gave chase, but was having trouble keeping up. "Slow down," I yelled, trying to get him to listen. "We need to stick together." But he didn't listen. His light was bobbing back and forth as he ran, and I continued to follow. I slipped in a pile of mud and got it all in my mouth. I looked up just as I was regaining my bearings. When I looked up, I saw a silhouette standing 50 feet away. It looked like a large German shepherd on its back legs. Its ears were pointing up, and its muzzle, it looked like it was pointing in a different direction. I looked down and saw it didn't have front legs, but what looked like arms, with hands and fingers tipped with claws. It seemed to be covered in grey matted fur, but what stood out the most were its piercing yellow eyes. I saw it run off in the direction Garrett was going, so I quickly stood up and gave chase. If Garrett was in danger, I had to do something, and I ran, and I started to hear gunshots, and eventually saw Garrett's light in the distance. He stopped shooting, and I saw the light point at the ground like he was reloading. I caught up and asked him if he saw it. He looked over and noticed Oscar on the ground, his back against a tree, and asked if he was okay. "He's just unconscious," he replied. "We gotta take him home." We both picked him up, slung an arm around our shoulders, and made our way back to the house. We knew, should I say, we were being watched. We could hear movement when we moved, and it stopped when we stopped. I drew my pistol with my free hand and switched on the light attached to it. My eyes stung as sweat made its way inside. Garrett and I were both out of breath, and we still had quite a long way to go. After walking for about 20 minutes, Oscar awoke. We stopped to ask him what happened, and he started to explain things to me, but was cut off by the sound of a branch snapping. Garrett and I both trained our lights in that direction, and saw the now familiar flash of grey just at the edge of the light. I turned in that direction and fired 3 shots. We heard a growl and the sound of something big running away, and we then booked it. If I had kept track of time and the direction as well, we should have broken out of the tree line in 10 minutes and then see the light from the house. Fortunately, I was right. We ran through the pasture, made it to the fence, crossed the street, and I asked Oscar to unlock the door. He couldn't find the keys, so we tried the window. We went to the back of the house and managed to remove the AC from a window, which Oscar then climbed through. He let us in, and the rest of the night was uneventful. The next day, we talked to the owner of the pasture. He found 3 of his cows dead and partially eaten. He also found a trail of blood into the wooded area that led towards the house, and then the opposite direction to the edge of his property. He also found Oscar's keys on the ground where he'd been knocked out, and where we found him. The farmer explained the blood trail led to the land owned by an old hermit who lives in a trailer in the woods. He apparently never leaves and has relatives bring him food, and is rumored to have messed with the occult in his younger days. We told the farmer everything, but he didn't believe us, thinking we saw a pack of rabid coyotes or feral dogs. So, what could it have been? Was it a wolf-like cryptid? A werewolf? A dogman? My friend still lives in the same house, and he hasn't seen or heard anything since. My dad and I were hunting in the Poconos. So me and my dad were sitting in a hunting tower. It was cold as hell, and we start hearing what sounded like one of those old religious chants where they all sing together in Latin while walking in a straight line. It kept getting closer till we saw movement about 20 meters ahead, and then we saw a group of about 10 to 30 people, all in white holding candles, and then about 5 more people with rifles and shotguns standing in the front and back on the sides. We let them pass, and they were staring at us as they walked by, but it was scary as hell. About 10 minutes after they walked by, we went over to where they were standing. It was snowy out there, and there were 0 footsteps in the snow, and to this day we still don't even know what the hell we saw. I grew up on a farm, and in high school I used to mess with my friends by hiding and making them find me. One night, my friend was over and we were waiting on this other guy. We see him pull up, so we take off running to hide. It's funny because they have to wander around somewhere they're unfamiliar with, or go ask my parents and be told, "Too bad, you'll have to find her." It's like a forced hide and seek. Anyway, this one night, my friend hid in one of the buildings while I ran for the trees. I was hiding under some bushes and heard breathing, like human breathing. There were no animals about, and it creeped me out so bad I ran out of the hiding to greet my friend. I felt so uncomfortable for the rest of the night. Sometime during the night, my dad heard something and went out to investigate. In the morning, he discovered that one of our cows was killed and butchered. One time I was walking my dog with my friend, who says that he could see spirits around some cliffs, and we took an overgrown trail and there was a bunny hole. My dog stopped, stared at it, then booked it. We then heard metallic screeching sounds coming from that hole, and a feeling of wrongness came over me. My friend freaked the hell out and legged it. I ran too. When we got home, my dog was shivering and looked out the window, and my friend and I still haven't figured out what it was. Days later, there was a landslide there, collapsing the cliff and probably killing or destroying whatever it was hiding in there. Perhaps we'll never know. I was camping in Florida on the Appalachian Trail. I was approached by a group of inbred-looking men who started shouting at me. At first, I couldn't understand what they were saying, but as my brain slowly processed, did I understand the following. "We could gut ya, and nobody heard you scream," and started pointing their rifles at me. I took off in the swamp and heard gunshots behind me, and they genuinely seemed disappointed that they missed. I don't camp alone, nor unarmed, anymore. I was a field geologist in the outback, about 12 hours north of Adelaide. One day I was driving the truck and saw what looked like a flagpole sticking up in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't anywhere near a farm or anywhere else that people would be, so I decided to drive over and check it out. It was a dead dog, fully impaled on a spike, like from butt to mouth. Took some pictures and had my boss call the cops, but for the rest of the assignment I was freaked out that some maniac was out there with me.